The first rays of sunlight had not yet fully spread across the streets of the capital city, Ouagadougou. The metropolis was slowly awakening from its slumber, stretching into consciousness with the reluctant grace of a city that had seen too many mornings like this one. Somewhere in the distance, the persistent honking of rickshaws pierced the early morning silence, their drivers already navigating the narrow lanes in search of their first passengers of the day. The sound was as much a part of the city's heartbeat as the call to prayer that would soon echo from the minarets scattered throughout the urban landscape. Street vendors were already at work, pushing their wooden carts laden with fresh vegetables through the quiet streets. The wheels creaked and groaned against the uneven pavement, creating a rhythmic symphony that spoke of daily survival and relentless perseverance. Nurses in their crisp blue uniforms walked briskly toward the central hospital, their faces set with the determined expression of those who knew that life and death awaited their arrival. Their footsteps were purposeful, each stride carrying them toward another shift filled with challenges that would test their skills and their hearts. It was an ordinary day beginning like countless others before it. The city was caught in that delicate moment between night and day, between darkness and light, between sleep and wakefulness. The air still held the coolness of the night, but already there were hints of the heat that would soon blanket the streets. Shop owners were rolling up their shutters, the metallic clatter announcing their readiness for business. The aroma of fresh bread began to waft from the bakeries, mingling with the scent of exhaust fumes and dust that seemed permanently embedded in the city's atmosphere. But amid all this familiar urban choreography, there was one scene that was anything but ordinary. Near the iron gates of the city's main hospital, standing perfectly still as the world rushed past him, was an 8-year-old boy named Yasin. His thin, malnourished frame seemed almost transparent in the morning light, as if he might disappear if someone looked away for too long. His feet were bare, caked with dried mud that told the story of a long journey on unpaved roads. The soil from his village still clung to his toes, a connection to the home he had left behind in desperation. His shirt, if it could be called that, was missing several buttons, and the fabric was so worn that it seemed ready to disintegrate at the slightest touch. The garment hung loosely on his small body, offering little protection against the morning chill. His hair was disheveled, uncombed for days, and his face bore the unmistakable marks of exhaustion, dark circles under his eyes, hollow cheeks, and a tightness around his mouth that spoke of fears too heavy for a child to carry. In Yasin's trembling hands was a piece of cardboard, torn from an old box that someone had discarded. The edges were bent and dirty, curled from being clutched too tightly for too long. The cardboard was pressed against his chest as if it were the most precious thing in the world, as if letting go of it would mean letting go of hope itself. On this makeshift sign, written in a shaky hand that betrayed both fear and determination, were 6 words that would change everything. "My mother is sick. Please help." The letters were uneven, some larger than others, clearly written by someone who had struggled with each stroke. There were places where the marker had pressed too hard, creating dark blotches, and other places where it had barely made contact with the surface, leaving faint traces that were hard to read. But the message was clear enough, heartbreaking in its simplicity and devastating in its urgency. People passed by in a steady stream. Some glanced at the boy and quickly looked away, their eyes sliding past him as if he were invisible, as if acknowledging his presence would somehow obligate them to action they were not prepared to take. Others paused for a moment, their steps slowing as they read the sign, their faces showing a flicker of sympathy before they hurried on their way, perhaps telling themselves that someone else would help, that one person couldn't make a difference, that they had their own problems to worry about. A businessman in a pressed suit walked by, his leather briefcase swinging at his side, his phone pressed to his ear as he barked orders to someone on the other end. He didn't even see Yasin. A woman carrying groceries stopped, her eyes meeting the boy's for a brief second. Something like pain crossed her face, but then she shifted her bags and continued walking, her pace quickening as if trying to outrun her conscience. A group of students laughed as they passed, absorbed in their own world of upcoming exams and weekend plans. Completely oblivious to the desperate plea standing just feet away from them, Yasin had been standing there for hours. The sun had risen higher in the sky, and still he stood. His legs ached with fatigue. His feet burned from standing on the hot pavement, and his throat was dry with thirst. But he didn't move. He couldn't move. This was his last hope, his final desperate attempt to save the person who meant everything to him. There were no tears in his eyes, though surely he had cried them all in the long hours of the night as he made his way to the city. What remained now was a silence, a profound stillness that spoke more eloquently than any words could. It was not the silence of defeat, but the silence of absolute determination. It was the silence of a child who had made a decision that no child should ever have to make, who had taken on a burden that would crush most adults, and who refused to give up no matter how many people ignored him. No matter how hopeless the situation seemed, this was a resolve that was far too large for such a small body to contain, a strength that defied explanation. It was the kind of courage that comes not from ignorance of danger, but from love so fierce that fear becomes irrelevant. Yasin knew the odds were against him. He understood that most people would walk past without helping. But he also knew that his mother's life depended on him, and that knowledge gave him the strength to stand there hour after hour, waiting for someone, anyone, to see him, to truly see him and to care. Meanwhile, deep inside the hospital complex, President Ibrahim Traoré was concluding a meeting that had stretched far longer than scheduled. The conference room was sterile and cold, with harsh fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly ill. Charts and graphs were projected on the screen at the front of the room, displaying statistics that told a story of a healthcare system in crisis. Red lines sloped downward, indicating declining resources. Blue bars showed the overwhelming number of patients compared to available beds. Black numbers detailed the budgetary shortfalls that seemed to grow larger. With each passing quarter, the hospital had been struggling for years under the crushing weight of inadequate resources and an overwhelming number of patients. Every day, more people came seeking treatment than the facility could possibly handle. Doctors worked double shifts, nurses operated on the edge of exhaustion, and essential medicines ran out with alarming regularity. The infrastructure was crumbling, pipes leaked, equipment malfunctioned, and entire wings of the hospital had been closed due to safety concerns. President Ibrahim had not come here today to make speeches or empty promises. The kind of political theater that had become so common it was meaningless. He had come to see the reality with his own eyes, to walk the corridors, to speak with the staff, to understand the magnitude of the crisis facing his country's healthcare system. He had spent the morning touring wards where patients lay two to a bed, where family members slept on the floors because there were no chairs, where the smell of disinfectant couldn't quite mask the underlying odor of despair. He had spoken with doctors who told him they had to choose which patients to treat because they couldn't save everyone. He had met nurses who described holding the hands of dying patients because there was no medicine left to give them. He had seen the pharmacy shelves, bare except for a few boxes of basic painkillers. He had witnessed a young mother being turned away because there was no room in the maternity ward, sent back into the streets with complications that could kill her and her unborn child. The weight of these encounters pressed down on his shoulders as he exited through the back door of the hospital, needing a moment of fresh air, a brief respite from the overwhelming evidence of systemic failure. His security detail surrounded him at a discreet distance, their eyes scanning the area as they always did, vigilant against threats both seen and unseen. His advisors were already thinking about the next appointment, checking their watches, mentally preparing for the motorcade journey back to the presidential palace. But as President Ibrahim stepped into the morning light, something made him stop. In the chaos of the city, amid all the noise and movement and urgency, he felt an unexpected stillness, a quiet that pulled at his attention like a whisper in a crowded room. It was the kind of moment that happens rarely in life, when the universe seems to pause and point, saying, "Look here. This matters." He turned his head and saw him, a thin boy standing by the hospital gate, alone and motionless, holding a piece of cardboard against his chest. While everything around him moved, he stood perfectly still. While everyone else rushed past, he waited with infinite patience. There was something profound in that stillness, something that called out to be witnessed. President Ibrahim began walking toward the boy, his stride slow and deliberate. His security team tensed, hands moving instinctively toward weapons, uncertain about this deviation from protocol. But the president raised a hand signaling them to remain calm, to give him space. He approached Yasin with the careful steps of someone approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. Or perhaps more accurately, with the reverence of someone approaching something sacred. As he drew closer, he could see the details that distance had hidden. The boy's feet were cracked and bleeding. His legs were streaked with dirt and scratches. The cardboard sign he held was filthy, covered with fingerprints and stains. But it was the boy's eyes that struck President Ibrahim most forcefully. They held no fear, no shame, no anger. They held only a profound determination and a quiet dignity that seemed impossible for someone so young. Yasin looked up as the president approached, but he did not bow his head in deference. He did not extend his hand in greeting. He did not plead or cry or beg. He simply stood there, holding his sign, his entire being devoted to a single purpose, saving his mother. This lack of servility, this quiet strength, moved President Ibrahim in a way that no political meeting ever had. The president bent down, lowering himself until he was at eye level with the boy, acknowledging him not as a powerful man condescending to a beggar, but as one human being recognizing another. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, stripped of all political polish and presidential authority. "What is your name?" he asked. "Yasin," the boy replied softly, his voice hoarse from hours of silence. "And where is your mother?" the president asked, though he already suspected the answer would break his heart. The boy's response was simple and devastating. "In our village. She cannot breathe. There is no medicine. No one will help." These words cut through President Ibrahim like a knife, sharp and clean and deep. All morning he had been reviewing reports, studying statistics, analyzing data about the healthcare crisis. The numbers had been overwhelming. Thousands of people without access to basic medical care, hundreds of clinics operating without essential supplies, dozens of hospitals on the verge of collapse. But numbers, no matter how large, remain abstract. They don't have faces. They don't have names. They don't stand in front of you with bare feet and desperate eyes. Here in this child, all those abstract numbers became flesh and blood. Here was the reality behind the statistics. A boy who had walked alone from his village to the capital city, who had stood for hours holding a cardboard sign, who had undertaken a journey that would have daunted grown men, all for the love of his mother. This was leadership's greatest challenge and its deepest shame. Seeing the human cost of policy failures, witnessing the direct consequences of systemic neglect, President Ibrahim reached out and gently took Yasin's hand. The boy's fingers were small and cold, trembling slightly from exhaustion and perhaps from disbelief that someone had finally stopped. Someone had finally listened. "Come," the president said, his voice thick with emotion. "Let us go to your mother together. Both of us right now." For the first time, a light flickered in Yasin's eyes. It was the light of hope, fragile as a candle flame, but impossibly bright. It was the light of belief that perhaps, just perhaps, his impossible journey had not been in vain. It was the light of a child who had been invisible for so long suddenly being seen. President Ibrahim turned to his aide and spoke firmly. "Bring the car. Now." Then, turning back to Yasin with a voice that carried both authority and tenderness, he said, "We are going to your mother." "I promise you." Yasin clutched his cardboard sign even tighter if that was possible, as if releasing it might cause this miracle to dissolve like morning mist. His whole body was tense, caught between the terror of hope disappointed and the desperate need to believe. Slowly, carefully, as if afraid that sudden movement might shatter this moment, he placed his small hand in the president's larger one. His eyes still held a shadow of disbelief. This couldn't be real, couldn't be happening. Surely he would wake up and find himself still standing by the gate, ignored and alone. But there was also, for the first time in days, the beginning of hope. Like the first star appearing in the evening sky, barely visible but undeniably there, hope began to illuminate the darkness that had surrounded him. The car arrived, a simple vehicle without any official markings or flags. The door opened and Yasin hesitated at the threshold of this new world. The seats seemed enormous to him, luxurious beyond anything he had ever experienced. His small body seemed to disappear into the cushions as he climbed inside. His feet didn't reach the floor, dangling inches above the carpet. He placed his cardboard sign carefully in his lap, cradling it like a holy relic, like the most important document in the world, because to him it was. President Ibrahim settled into the seat beside him. The door closed with a solid thunk that spoke of quality engineering and careful maintenance. The car began to move, leaving the hospital behind, gliding through the city streets with a smoothness that must have seemed magical to a boy who had walked for hours on rough roads. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence between them was deep but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence in which hearts speak more loudly than words, in which understanding passes between people without the need for language. Outside the windows, the city continued its frantic pace, people rushing to work, merchants calling out their wares, children in school uniforms walking in orderly lines. But inside the car, there was only this profound quiet, this sacred space of connection. Finally, President Ibrahim broke the silence, his voice gentle and inviting. "Tell me about your mother." Yasin's eyes lowered, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet but remarkably steady for a child who had endured so much. "My mother used to sew clothes." Everyone in the village came to her. She would work day and night, her needle flashing in the lamplight, creating beauty from simple cloth. She could make anything: wedding dresses, children's clothes, blankets, curtains. Her fingers moved so fast I could barely follow them. She would sing while she worked, old songs her mother taught her. He paused, swallowing hard before continuing. "But now she cannot get out of bed. She coughs all night long, terrible sounds that shake her whole body. Her hands tremble so badly she cannot hold a needle anymore. Working is impossible now. She cannot even stand up by herself. Sometimes she tries, but she falls. I have to help her with everything. Eating, drinking, going to the bathroom. She has become so weak, so thin. I can see her bones through her skin." The words hung in the air, heavy with grief and fear. President Ibrahim listened without interruption, his face growing more serious with each detail. In this moment, he was not acting as president. He was simply a human being receiving another human being's pain, opening his heart to the reality of suffering that statistics could never capture. The car left the crowded city behind, transitioning from paved roads to dirt paths. Trees appeared on either side, their branches creating dappled shadows on the ground. Clouds of dust rose behind the vehicle as it made its way through the countryside. Yasin stared out the window, but his mind was clearly elsewhere, focused entirely on the need to reach his mother, to bring help before it was too late. President Ibrahim studied the boy's profile, the sharp line of his jaw, the determined set of his mouth, the way his fingers never stopped clutching that cardboard sign. "How did you manage to do all this alone?" he asked. "How did you even know where to go?" Yasin's answer was delivered with the straightforward honesty of childhood. "When my mother's breathing got so bad that she couldn't catch her breath, when I saw the fear in her eyes and knew she was dying, I ran. I didn't think about it, I just ran. Our village has no medicine, no phones to call for help, no doctor, no clinic. We have nothing. But I remembered someone once mentioning a big hospital in the city. I didn't know where it was exactly or how far or what I would do when I got there. I just knew I had to try." His voice cracked slightly, but he maintained his composure, refusing to let tears fall. "I walked all night. I asked people for directions. Some pointed the way, some told me to go home, some ignored me completely. My feet hurt so much I thought I couldn't take another step, but I kept walking. I was so scared. Scared that I was going the wrong way, scared that I would be too late, scared that no one would help even if I made it to the city. But I was more scared of losing my mother. That fear pushed me forward." He turned to look directly at President Ibrahim, his young eyes holding depths of experience no child should possess. "I never imagined that you would stop. that someone like you would see me, would care. President Ibrahim felt his throat tighten with emotion. He reached out and placed a hand on Yasin's shoulder, feeling the fragile bones beneath the thin fabric. Yasin, you are one of the bravest people I have ever met. You have done something extraordinary. You have traveled a difficult road that would make grown men hesitate. You have shown more courage and love than most people show in their entire lives. Yasin looked down at his hands, at the cardboard sign that had become his talisman. She is everything to me, he whispered. My father died when I was very young. I barely remember him. It has always been just my mother and me. She works so hard to take care of me, to make sure I have food, that I am safe. She has sacrificed everything for me. I cannot lose her. I won't lose her. The conviction in his voice was absolute, unshakable. It was the voice of someone who had already decided that failure was not an option, that giving up was impossible. At 8 years old, this child had made a commitment that would have challenged the strongest adult. President Ibrahim felt tears stinging his eyes, but he blinked them away. He was witnessing something profound, the purest expression of love, the kind of devotion that required no recognition or reward, that simply existed because it had to, because it was woven into the very fabric of this child's being. The car continued its journey through the countryside, carrying not just two people, but a moment that would change everything. On one side sat a boy whose fearless love had driven him to impossible acts of courage. On the other side sat a leader whose heart was being opened to the true soul of his nation, seeing clearly for perhaps the first time what leadership actually meant. Not power or position, but service, not speeches or ceremonies, but presence and compassion. The car moved steadily away from the capital, leaving behind the concrete and steel of urban development. The paved roads gave way to rough dirt paths that tested the vehicle's suspension. Dust billowed up from the wheels, creating temporary clouds that hung in the still air before slowly settling. Tall trees lined the route, their long shadows stretching across the road like dark fingers pointing the way forward. Yasin pressed his face against the window, his eyes scanning the landscape with increasing recognition. Every landmark brought him closer to home, closer to his mother, closer to the moment when he would know whether his desperate gamble had succeeded or failed. His heart raced with a mixture of hope and dread. What if they were too late? What if, despite everything, despite this miracle of the president himself coming to help, they arrived to find his mother had already slipped away? He clutched his cardboard sign even tighter, his knuckles white with the pressure. To him, this piece of torn cardboard was more than just a sign. It was a lifeline, a connection between his mother's fragile life and the possibility of salvation. As long as he held it, as long as he didn't let go, there was still hope. President Ibrahim watched the boy continuously, his mind churning with difficult questions. How many other children were there like Yasin, desperate for help, walking impossible distances because no one else would act? How many hands were raised in silent supplication, holding signs that no one bothered to read? How many mothers lay dying in distant villages because the healthcare system had failed them? He saw reports and budget files every day, examined charts and statistical analyses, listened to presentations from health ministers and medical experts. But all of that was abstract, removed from reality by layers of bureaucracy and political posturing. Sitting here beside Yasin, he was confronted with living, breathing proof of systemic failure. This was not a number in a report. This was a child who had been forced to become a hero because the system had abandoned him and his mother. The car turned onto an even narrower path, and small structures began to appear on either side. These were not houses in any meaningful sense. They were huts and shacks constructed from mud, corrugated metal, and salvaged materials. Some had thatched roofs that had seen better days. Others were covered with sheets of rusted tin held down by rocks and bricks. These were the homes of people whom the modern world had forgotten, who lived beyond the reach of electricity, running water, and basic medical care. Yasin, President Ibrahim asked softly, how much farther? The boy pointed straight ahead with one trembling finger. Just there, behind those trees. That is where we live. As the car approached the village, a group of children playing in the dirt road stopped their game and stared in astonishment. They had never seen a car like this in their village. Cars rarely came here at all, and certainly not vehicles this clean, this new, this obviously expensive. Their eyes widened with wonder and confusion. One child, slightly older than the others, suddenly shouted, "That's Yasin! Yasin is in that car!" Another voice called out, "Who is with him? Who brought him back?" The question hung in the air, unanswered but full of possibility. The children stood frozen, watching as the car came to a gentle stop. Yasin's hand moved to the door handle, and he pushed it open with both hands, the door being heavy and resistant. He climbed out, his bare feet finding the familiar ground of his village, the same earth he had walked on for his entire short life. But he was different now. There was a new confidence in his posture, a new determination in his eyes. He was no longer just the boy who had left in desperation. He was the boy who had found help, who had completed his impossible mission. He reached back and took President Ibrahim's hand, pulling him gently toward his home. Women who had been cooking over open fires paused in their work, wooden spoons forgotten in their hands as they stared at the unexpected visitors. Men who had been sitting beneath an ancient tree discussing village matters and sharing stories fell silent and stood up, their faces showing confusion and curiosity. Who was this stranger that Yasin had brought back? And why did he carry himself with such authority? Word spread through the village with the speed of wildfire. Within minutes, it seemed that everyone knew something extraordinary was happening. People emerged from their homes, drawn by curiosity and the universal human response to the unusual. They gathered at a respectful distance, whispering among themselves, trying to understand what their eyes were showing them. Yasin led the way to his house, though calling it a house was generous. It was a single-room structure made of mud bricks that were crumbling at the corners. The roof was a patchwork of old metal sheets, some rusted through in places, held down by whatever heavy objects could be found, stones, broken bricks, pieces of wood. Instead of a door, a tattered cloth hung across the entrance, moving slightly in the breeze, offering neither privacy nor security. "Amma!" Yasin called out urgently, his voice cracking with emotion. "Mother!" There was no response. The silence that greeted his call was terrifying. For a moment, Yasin's face went white with fear. Had they arrived too late? Had his mother died while he was gone? His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he pushed aside the cloth door and rushed inside. President Ibrahim followed him into the dim interior. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the darkness. There was a single small window, covered with a piece of cloth to keep out the dust, allowing only a thin trickle of light to penetrate the gloom. The room was tiny, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, with a dirt floor that had been swept clean but could never be truly clean. The walls were bare except for one shelf that held a few battered cooking pots and a nearly empty sack of rice, and there, on a mat on the floor covered with a thin, worn blanket, lay a woman. She was painfully thin, her cheekbones prominent, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. Her breathing was labored and irregular, each breath seeming to require immense effort. Her hands, which Yasin had described as once being so skilled with a needle, now trembled continuously even as she lay still. Her skin had a gray pallor that spoke of serious illness, but she was alive. Her eyes were open, and when she heard her son's voice, she managed to turn her head slightly. Her gaze found Yasin first, and despite her weakness, something like relief flooded her features. Then her eyes moved to the man standing behind her son. This stranger in clean clothes who clearly didn't belong in a place like this. "Yasin," she whispered, her voice barely audible, each word an obvious struggle. Who is this?" President Ibrahim moved forward and knelt beside her mat, showing no concern for his expensive clothes or his dignity. He took her trembling hand in both of his touch gentle and warm. When he spoke, his voice carried no trace of political formality or presidential distance. He spoke as one human being to another, with simple honesty and profound respect. "Your son is someone who cares deeply about you. He walked alone to the city. He found me and brought me here. Your son is extraordinarily brave." Tears began to well up in the woman's eyes, spilling over and running down her hollow cheeks. She looked at Yasin with an expression that mixed pride, gratitude, love, and heartbreak. How could she have asked so much of him? How could her child have done something so impossible? She tried to smile, her cracked lips trembling with the effort. President Ibrahim continued softly. Help is here now. You are not alone anymore. We are going to make sure you get the care you need. For the first time in weeks, perhaps months, a ray of hope penetrated the darkness of that small room. It was fragile, barely there, but undeniably real. Yasin knelt beside his mother and took her other hand, his cardboard sign finally set aside, its purpose fulfilled. The three of them remained there in that moment, a dying mother, her heroic son, and a leader who had finally remembered what true leadership meant. A profound stillness filled the small mud-brick room. The only sounds were the mother's labored breathing and the distant murmur of villagers gathering outside. Shafts of dusty sunlight penetrated through gaps in the walls, illuminating particles floating in the air like tiny stars. The room smelled of sickness, of unwashed bodies and stale air, of poverty and desperation. President Ibrahim remained kneeling beside the woman, still holding her trembling hand. This hand had once held a needle with precision and skill, creating beautiful garments that brought joy to the village. This hand had cared for a child alone after her husband's death, had worked tirelessly to provide food and shelter. Now it could barely grip anything, the fingers weak and cold, the skin papery thin. "Don't worry," he said gently, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "Help is coming now." Yasin sat at his mother's feet, his young face a mixture of exhaustion and cautious hope. His mother tried to speak, her lips moving, but the words caught in her throat. She had so many questions. How had her son made it to the city? Who had helped him? How had he found this man who seemed so important? But her body was too weak for questions. All she could do was look at her son with eyes that spoke volumes, expressing love and pride and wonder and regret all at once. President Ibrahim pulled out his mobile phone, his fingers moving quickly across the screen. When the call connected, his voice became firm and commanding, though still touched with urgency. "Marie, I need you to assemble a medical team immediately. We have a patient in critical condition in a village outside the city. Bring medicines, oxygen, clean water, and food supplies. Everything necessary for emergency treatment. Do not waste any time. I am sending you the location now." He ended the call and immediately turned his attention back to the woman. Yasin watched this with amazement. For the first time in days, the terrible weight on his shoulders began to lift just slightly. His cardboard sign, which had been his constant companion, his plea to the world, lay on the dirt floor now. Its work was done. The message had finally been received. Outside, the villagers continued to gather. News had spread through the community with remarkable speed. Everyone knew that Yasin's mother was dying, that the boy had left to seek help, and now somehow, impossibly, he had returned with someone who seemed powerful enough to actually make a difference. People crowded around the small structure, trying to peer through gaps in the walls, whispering to each other in hushed, excited tones. "Is that really the president?" one voice asked incredulously. "How could it be? Why would he come here?" Another responded. "Maybe it's a dream," someone suggested. "Maybe we've all fallen asleep and are dreaming together." The gathering became a vigil. Women who had been preparing meals abandoned their cooking fires. Men who had been working in the fields put down their tools and came to witness this unprecedented event. Children squeezed through the crowd, trying to get a better view. The entire village seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Inside the tiny home, time seemed to slow down. President Ibrahim found a clay pot with some water in it and carefully helped Yasin's mother take a few small sips. She coughed and sputtered but managed to swallow some, the liquid bringing the first relief her parched throat had felt in days. Yasin watched every movement with intense focus, memorizing this moment. "This impossible kindness being shown to his mother, sir," Yasin said quietly, the first words he had spoken since entering the house. "Thank you." President Ibrahim looked at the boy, and in that look was a recognition of what this child had accomplished. "No, Yasin, thank you. You have taught me something very important today. You have reminded me why I accepted the responsibility of leadership in the first place." The boy didn't fully understand these words, but he recognized the sincerity in them. For the first time since this ordeal began, he felt like he could breathe properly. The terrible fear that had driven him forward, the desperate certainty that if he failed, his mother would die, began to ease just slightly. Perhaps 20 minutes later, though it felt like hours to those waiting, the sound of vehicle engines could be heard approaching. The distinctive rumble grew louder, and dust clouds appeared on the horizon, marking the arrival of help. The village children ran toward the sound, excited and curious. A white van, pristine and official-looking, pulled up beside the president's car. The doors opened and several people emerged. Marie, a senior medical coordinator, was first out, her face set with professional determination. Behind her came two nurses in clean uniforms, a young doctor carrying a large medical bag, and two assistants carrying boxes of supplies. They moved with practiced efficiency, gathering their equipment and heading toward the structure where Yasin's mother lay dying. The villagers stepped back, creating a path, their faces showing a mixture of awe and hope. This was more help than their village had seen in years, perhaps ever. The medical team worked quickly but calmly, each person knowing exactly what needed to be done. When they entered the small room, Marie stopped for just a moment, her eyes taking in the scene. The president kneeling beside a dying woman, a small boy sitting protectively near his mother. The dirt floor, the bare walls, the evidence of desperate poverty everywhere. Her professional mask slipped for just a second, revealing shock and compassion, before she regained her composure. "This is the patient," President Ibrahim said quietly, standing to give the medical team room to work. Marie nodded. "We'll take care of her, sir." The young doctor knelt where the president had been moments before. He opened his bag with practiced motions, removing a stethoscope and other instruments. Placing the stethoscope in his ears, he carefully positioned it on the woman's back, listening intently to the sounds within. His face grew more serious as he listened to the labored, irregular breathing, the clear signs of severe respiratory infection. "She has a serious lung infection," he announced to his team. "But we can treat this. We're not too late." Those words, "we're not too late," seemed to inject new life into everyone in the room. A nurse immediately checked the patient's blood pressure, wrapping the cuff around her thin arm and pumping the bulb. Another nurse began searching for a vein in the woman's hand, preparing to insert an IV line. An injection was prepared with practiced hands, and an oxygen mask was gently placed over the woman's face. Yasin stood in the corner, watching every movement with wide eyes, his hands still trembling slightly. He was afraid to believe this was real, terrified that somehow this miracle would evaporate and he would find himself back at the hospital gate, alone and ignored once more. Marie noticed the boy standing there and moved toward him. She knelt down to his eye level, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "This is happening because of you," she said softly. "Because you were brave enough to go get help. Because you didn't give up." Yasin didn't respond with words, but his shoulders, which had been rigid with tension for so long, finally relaxed just a little. The burden he had been carrying alone was now shared by others who knew what to do, who had the tools and knowledge to save his mother. The treatment began in earnest. The room, which had been filled with the silence of despair, now hummed with purposeful activity. The IV drip was connected, and clear liquid began flowing through the tube, carrying essential fluids and antibiotics into the woman's dehydrated body. Each drop that fell from the bag was like a tiny piece of hope, accumulating into something that might save a life. The oxygen mask covered the woman's face, and with each breath, she was receiving the clean, concentrated oxygen her struggling lungs so desperately needed. The soft hiss of the oxygen flow became a kind of music, a sound of healing and possibility. Gradually, minute by minute, her breathing began to change. The terrible ragged gasps became smoother, more regular. The panic that had filled her eyes whenever she couldn't catch her breath began to fade. President Ibrahim stood back, watching the medical team work. He wasn't giving orders or making demands. He wasn't performing for cameras or thinking about how this would look in tomorrow's newspapers. He was simply present, bearing witness to this moment. For him, this was not just one woman being treated. This was the entire country's failure made visible, the human cost of systems that didn't work, of resources that never reached those who needed them most. Outside, the villagers maintained their vigil. They couldn't see what was happening inside, but they could hear the sounds of medical equipment, the calm professional voices giving instructions, the evidence that real help had finally arrived. Some of the women began to pray quietly, their lips moving in silent supplication. Some of the men simply stood with heads bowed, processing what this meant, that perhaps they weren't as forgotten as they had believed. After what felt like an eternity but was actually less than an hour, the young doctor finally looked up from his patient. His face showed cautious optimism. "The crisis has passed," he announced. "She's stabilized. The infection is serious, but with continued treatment and monitoring, she will recover." These words broke through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. Yasin's face transformed. For the first time since this nightmare began, tears came to his eyes, not tears of despair or fear, but tears of relief so profound it was almost painful. He rushed to his mother's side and carefully took her hand, mindful of the IV line attached to it. "Amma," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I won't leave you alone. Never again." His mother's eyes, which had been so clouded with pain and confusion, now showed recognition and love. She couldn't speak clearly with the oxygen mask on, but she squeezed her son's hand with whatever strength she had left. That squeeze said everything that needed to be said. The room, which had been a place of death waiting to happen, had become a place where life reasserted itself. The change was almost tangible, as if the air itself had become lighter, cleaner, filled with possibility rather than resignation. Night began to descend on the village with the gentle inevitability of nature's rhythms. The sky transformed from blue to orange to deep purple, and stars began to appear one by one. But inside Yasin's small home, the light was different. Battery-powered medical lamps had been set up, casting a clean, bright glow that pushed back the shadows that usually dominated this space. Yasin's mother continued to improve with each passing hour. Her breathing, which had been so labored and frightening, was now steady and regular. The color was slowly returning to her face. The panic that had filled her eyes whenever consciousness returned had been replaced by peace. She was still weak, still seriously ill, but she was no longer standing at death's door. Marie stood near the entrance, watching the scene with professional satisfaction, but also with deep emotion. She had been a medical coordinator for many years, had overseen countless treatments and interventions, but this felt different. This felt like more than just saving one life. This felt like a moment that deserved to be remembered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her mobile phone. Moving carefully to avoid disturbing anyone, she opened the camera application. Through the lens, she framed a scene that captured everything important about this day. In the image, President Ibrahim Traoré sat on the dirt floor of a mud brick hut, holding the hand of a poor, sick woman. There was no throne, no podium, no trappings of power, just a leader who had remembered what service truly meant. Beside them stood Yasin, still holding his cardboard sign, his thin frame and bare feet telling the story of his journey. His eyes showed exhaustion, but also the profound relief of having saved the person he loved most. Marie looked at the photograph she had taken and felt its power. This was not a staged photo opportunity. This was genuine human connection, authentic compassion, real leadership. After a moment of contemplation, she typed a caption. "Leadership means listening. Change begins here." She hesitated for just a second, her finger hovering over the share button. Then, feeling that this moment was too important to keep private, she posted the photograph to social media. She had no idea that this simple action would set off a chain reaction that would sweep across the entire nation. The photograph began its digital journey quietly. A few dozen people saw it in the first hour, mostly Marie's colleagues and friends. But those people shared it with their networks, and those people shared it with theirs. And within hours, the image was spreading exponentially. By midnight, the photograph had reached the capital city of Ouagadougou. People scrolling through their phones before bed suddenly stopped, arrested by the powerful image. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Wealth and poverty, power and helplessness. meeting in a moment of genuine human connection. In cafes across the city, young people gathered around phones and tablets, showing each other the photograph, discussing what it meant. In one coffee shop, a heated debate broke out about whether this was genuine leadership or political theater. But even the cynics had to admit that something about the image rang true. In schools the next morning, teachers showed the photograph to their students. "What do you see in this picture?" they asked. The answers varied by age and perspective. Younger children saw a helper saving someone who was sick. Older students recognized the president and understood the significance of someone powerful caring about someone powerless. Some saw hope. Others saw an indictment of systems that had failed so many. The photograph reached a farmer in the eastern part of the country, a man who had become bitter and cynical after years of broken promises from politicians. He stared at the image for a long time, and something inside him shifted. The next morning, he made a decision. He would donate a portion of his harvest to poor families in neighboring villages. If a child could walk alone to the city to save his mother, if the president could sit on a dirt floor to help, then he could do something too. In a prestigious hospital in the capital, a nurse who had been considering quitting her job due to burnout saw the photograph and began to cry. She had entered medicine to help people, but somewhere along the way, the endless bureaucracy and overwhelming workload had made her forget why she cared. The image of President Ibrahim holding that woman's hand reminded her. She decided to stay, to keep fighting, to remember that each patient was someone's mother, someone's child, someone worth saving. A teacher in a rural school, struggling with limited resources and indifferent administrators, printed the photograph and hung it on her classroom wall. She told her students, "This is what it means to care. This is what it means to take responsibility. You don't need wealth or power to make a difference. You just need to see someone in need and decide to act." A young artist in the capital, moved by the photograph, went to an abandoned school building with his paints. On the largest wall, he created a massive mural. It showed a small boy holding his cardboard sign, and behind him, hundreds of hands reaching out, not to take, but to give, to help, to support. Below the mural, he painted words that captured what everyone was feeling. "We all have a sign. We just need eyes willing to see." Yasin remained unaware of all this. He sat beside his mother through the night, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest, listening to the reassuring beep of the medical monitors. He had no idea that his simple act of love had ignited something far larger than himself, that his cardboard sign had become a symbol recognized across the nation. His mother slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, her body finally able to rest now that she was receiving proper treatment. Occasionally, she would wake briefly, see her son sitting vigil beside her, and smile before drifting back into healing sleep. President Ibrahim had remained in the village as well. His security team had tried to convince him to return to the capital, citing security concerns and scheduling conflicts, but he had refused. "I will stay until I know she is stable," he had said firmly. "This is where I need to be." So he spent the night in that tiny village, talking with the doctor about the woman's prognosis, discussing with Marie how they could replicate this kind of rapid response across the country, and thinking deeply about what he had witnessed. This child, with no resources and no connections, had done what an entire government bureaucracy had failed to do. He had bridged the gap between need and help. As dawn broke on a new day, the village began to wake. But unlike yesterday, when people had woken to the familiar routine of survival and struggle, today they woke to possibility. The president of their country had spent the night in their village. Medical professionals were actively treating one of their own. Perhaps things could actually change. Morning light filtered through the gaps in the walls of Yasin's home, painting golden stripes across the dirt floor. The medical team had worked through the night in shifts, ensuring continuous monitoring of their patient. Yasin's mother was markedly improved. The gray pallor had left her skin, replaced by a healthier tone. Her breathing was steady and unlabored. When she opened her eyes, they were clear and focused. She looked at her son, who had finally fallen asleep sitting upright against the wall, his head tilted at an uncomfortable angle, exhaustion having finally overwhelmed him. Her eyes filled with tears, not of pain or fear this time, but of overwhelming gratitude and love. Her child had saved her life. Her 8-year-old son had accomplished the impossible. President Ibrahim, who had dozed intermittently in a chair the medical team had brought in, was now fully awake and on his phone. But he wasn't checking political news or responding to bureaucratic demands. He was looking at the photograph Marie had posted, scrolling through the thousands upon thousands of comments and shares it had accumulated overnight. The response was unlike anything he had seen in his political career. There were no partisan arguments, no political point scoring, no cynical dismissals. Instead, there was genuine emotion, authentic inspiration, real commitment to change. People from all walks of life were saying, "I want to help. What can I do? How can I make a difference?" He turned to Marie, who was checking the IV drip levels. "The photograph you posted," he said quietly. "It has reached millions of people." Marie looked up, surprised. "I only meant to share it with friends. I thought it was important to document." "You did more than document," President Ibrahim replied. "You sparked something. People are responding. They want to be part of the solution." He stood up, careful not to wake Yasin, and stepped outside into the morning air. The village was beginning to stir. Women were lighting cooking fires. Men were preparing for the day's work. Children were emerging from their homes. But everyone paused when they saw him, uncertain how to react to having their president standing in their midst. President Ibrahim walked to the center of the village, where several men had gathered under the ancient tree that served as the community's informal meeting place. As he approached, they quickly stood, showing respect but also confusion. Why was he still here? Shouldn't he have returned to the capital hours ago? "Please sit," President Ibrahim said, gesturing for them to return to their places. "I want to talk with you." The men exchanged glances but complied. The president sat down with them on the same dusty ground at the same level. "Tell me about your village," he said. "What are your greatest challenges?" At first, no one spoke. They were unused to being asked their opinions, especially by someone in power. But gradually, encouraged by his genuine interest, they began to talk. They spoke of the lack of medical care, of having to travel hours to reach the nearest clinic. They talked about children dying from treatable diseases. They described women dying in childbirth because there was no trained help available. They spoke of the difficulty of farming without access to good seeds or modern techniques. They mentioned the school that had closed years ago because no teacher would come to such a remote location. They described the struggle to get their produce to market and how middlemen took advantage of their desperation, paying them almost nothing for crops they had worked months to grow. President Ibrahim listened to all of it, asking questions, taking mental notes, truly hearing what these men were saying. This was not the filtered, sanitized information that reached him through official channels. This was raw, unvarnished reality. One old man, braver than the others, finally asked the question on everyone's mind. "Sir, why are you here? Men like you don't come to places like this. What does Yasin's mother mean to someone like you?" President Ibrahim was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Yasin's mother means everything," he finally said, "because she represents every person in this country whom the system has failed. She represents all the people who suffer in silence because they have no voice, no power, no way to be heard. When I saw Yasin standing at that hospital gate holding his cardboard sign, I saw my own failure as a leader. I saw the failure of everyone who has ever held power and forgotten what that power is supposed to be for." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I came here because a child shamed me with his courage. He showed me that love and determination can accomplish what bureaucracy and politics have failed to do. I came here because I needed to remember why I accepted this responsibility in the first place. Not to be powerful, but to serve." The old man nodded slowly, his eyes glistening. "Then perhaps there is hope," he said quietly. By afternoon, President Ibrahim had returned to the capital, but his mind remained in that village. His staff was confused by his behavior. He had canceled all his appointments for the day, which was unprecedented. Instead, he had called an emergency meeting of his cabinet and key advisors. The meeting was to begin at 4 p.m. in the main government building. When the ministers and officials arrived, they found the conference room set up unusually. There was no formal seating arrangement, no prepared agenda documents, no PowerPoint presentations ready to launch. Instead, at the head of the table, resting against an empty chair, was a piece of cardboard. On it, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "My mother is sick. Please help." The officials entered and stood uncertainly, staring at this unexpected sight. Where were the briefing papers? What was this meeting about? And what was that piece of cardboard doing there? When President Ibrahim entered, he didn't take his usual seat at the head of the table. Instead, he picked up the cardboard sign and held it up for everyone to see. "This," he said simply, "is our agenda." Complete silence filled the room. Eyes fixed on the president, waiting for an explanation. "For years," he began, his voice carrying both authority and emotion, "we have debated budgets, created plans, examined statistics. We have talked about healthcare reform in abstract terms, using numbers and percentages and projections. But leadership isn't about numbers. Leadership is about people, with real needs, who are suffering while we debate." He placed the cardboard sign on the table where everyone could see it. "These 6 words, written by a desperate child, have taught me more about governance than all the policy papers I've ever read. They have shown me that we have failed. Not because we lack resources, though resources are limited. Not because we lack good intentions, because I believe most of us want to do good. We have failed because we have forgotten to listen to the voices of those who need us most." He began to pace, his energy palpable. "Yesterday, I met a boy named Yasin, 8 years old. He walked alone from his village to the capital city because his mother was dying and there was no help available. He stood at a hospital gate for hours, holding this sign, ignored by hundreds of people. Think about that. A child had to walk for hours, had to beg strangers for help, had to do what grown men would fear to do because our system completely failed him and his mother." One of the ministers, the Minister of Health, shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, we have been working on healthcare expansion." "I know what we've been working on," President Ibrahim interrupted, his voice sharp. "I've read the reports. I've approved the budgets. But Yasin's mother was dying while we worked on our plans. How many others have died while we conducted our studies and formed our committees?" He stopped pacing and looked directly at his assembled officials. "Today, we are going to do something different. We are going to create a program that actually reaches people. Not in 5 years. Not after more studies now. Starting today. Over the next hour, President Ibrahim outlined a comprehensive initiative he was calling the Healing Hands. It had 3 main pillars, each designed to address the gaps that had nearly cost Yasin's mother her life. First, community emergency care. In every rural area, local volunteers would be trained in basic emergency medicine. They would be equipped with essential supplies and communication devices. They would serve as the first line of response, providing immediate care and connecting serious cases with proper medical facilities. These wouldn't be highly trained doctors. The country didn't have enough of those. But they would be community members who knew their neighbors, who lived among the people they served, who could respond within minutes rather than hours. Second, mobile health units. The country would deploy teams using vans, motorcycles, and even bicycles to bring basic health care directly to remote areas. These units would travel on regular schedules, providing vaccinations, prenatal care, treatment for common illnesses, and crucially, they would identify serious cases that needed advanced care. No one would have to walk for hours just to see a medical professional. Third, dignity support. Families in crisis would receive small grants to cover the cost of medicine and food during medical emergencies. No one would ever again have to choose between buying medicine for a sick relative and feeding their children. The amounts would be modest but sufficient to prevent the complete economic collapse that often accompanied serious illness in poor families. "This is impressive," said the finance minister slowly. "But, sir, the country is already facing economic pressure. Where will the money come from? How can we fund this?" President Ibrahim had anticipated this question. "We will immediately allocate 10% of the emergency fund to launch this program. Additionally, I am asking every government ministry to identify 5% of their budget that can be redirected to this initiative. Not all at once, but over the next 6 months. We will also create complete transparency. Every expenditure will be publicly posted online where citizens can see exactly where the money goes." Another minister spoke up, concern evident in his voice. Sir, with respect, previous initiatives have been undermined by corruption. What makes you think this will be different? Because, President Ibrahim replied firmly, this time, oversight won't be in the hands of politicians or bureaucrats. It will be in the hands of local elders, community health workers, and the people themselves. Trust will be built from the bottom up, not imposed from the top down. Every village that receives support will form a committee of local residents who will monitor how resources are used. If corruption is found, the community itself will report it, and there will be immediate consequences. He looked around the table, meeting each person's eyes. I know some of you think I'm being naive. I know some of you believe that corruption is so deeply embedded that it cannot be rooted out. But I also know that cynicism is easy and change is hard. I choose the hard path, and I expect every person in this room to choose it with me. The room was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, the Minister of Health began to nod. I'm with you, sir. This is why I entered public service, to actually serve the public. One by one, others voiced their support. Not all of them, and not all with complete conviction, but enough. It was a start. By evening, the announcement was made. Radio stations across the country broadcast a simple message. The Healing Hands Initiative begins today. No child will have to walk alone seeking help. No mother will die waiting for care we could have provided. Change starts now. President Ibrahim concluded his public statement with words that would be repeated across the nation. We did not start this movement. A boy named Yasin started it. We are simply following where his courage has led. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable began to happen. The village where Yasin lived became the program's first implementation site, a pilot that would serve as a model for expansion across the country. The small mud brick house where his mother had nearly died was now visited regularly by medical professionals. A small clinic structure was being built at the village center, constructed with donated labor from villagers who wanted to contribute to this change. Yasin's mother improved steadily. The infection that had nearly killed her was beaten back by antibiotics and proper care. Her strength returned gradually, and with it, her spirit. The trembling in her hands lessened. She was able to sit up, then stand, then take a few steps. Eventually, she was able to return to her sewing, though the medical team insisted she take regular breaks and not overwork herself. But the changes extended far beyond one woman, one village. The photograph that Marie had posted continued to circulate, inspiring action across the nation. It had become more than just an image. It had become a symbol, a rallying point, a reminder of what was possible when people chose to care. In the eastern region, a retired doctor who had been living in comfortable retirement saw the photograph and felt a profound calling. He packed medical supplies into his car and drove 6 hours to a remote area that had no healthcare access. He spent a month there, treating patients, training local volunteers, and establishing a basic medical outpost. When he finally returned home, 3 younger doctors called him saying they wanted to do the same thing. A movement was forming. In the capital city, university students organized a fundraising campaign. They collected donations to purchase basic medical supplies, bandages, antibiotics, pain relievers, antiseptics, and delivered them to rural clinics that had been operating with nearly empty shelves. They called their effort Yasin's Legacy and wore T-shirts with the image of the cardboard sign. Business owners, moved by the story, began to contribute. A wealthy textile manufacturer donated thousands of blankets to rural health centers. A pharmaceutical company agreed to provide medicines at cost, foregoing their usual profit margins for the initiative. A telecommunications company installed free communication systems in 50 remote villages, ensuring that emergencies could be reported quickly. Teachers incorporated Yasin's story into their lessons. They used it to teach about courage, about civic responsibility, about the power of individual action. Children across the country wrote essays about what they would do if they saw someone holding a sign asking for help. Many made pledges to never look away from someone in need. Even in the poorest communities, people found ways to contribute. A farmer who could barely feed his own family donated a sack of rice to the local health center. A woman who made her living selling vegetables in the market gave a portion of her earnings each week to help cover medical costs for families who couldn't afford treatment. A group of unemployed young men volunteered to serve as stretcher bearers, ready to carry sick people from their homes to the nearest road where vehicles could reach them. The initiative faced challenges, of course. In some areas, local officials tried to skim money meant for medical supplies. But when communities reported these incidents, President Ibrahim acted swiftly and publicly, prosecuting those responsible and replacing them with people committed to the program's mission. The message was clear: corruption would not be tolerated, and the people's trust would not be betrayed. Some critics argued that the program was unsustainable, that the initial enthusiasm would fade, that the systemic problems were too deeply rooted to fix. But month after month, the initiative continued to expand. Mobile health units reached more villages. More community health workers were trained. More families received the support they needed. Slowly, measurably, the number of preventable deaths in rural areas began to decline. The mural that the young artist had painted in the capital became a tourist attraction. People came from across the city to see it, to take photographs beside it, to read the message painted below. We all have a sign. We just need eyes willing to see. The wall became a place where people left notes, sharing their own stories of struggle and help received, creating a tapestry of communal experience and shared hope. Yasin himself remained largely untouched by his sudden fame. He knew that people were talking about him, that his story was being told across the country, but in his daily life, he was still just a boy. He helped his mother with chores. He played with friends. He attended the new school that had opened in the village, taught by a teacher who had volunteered to move there specifically because of the changes happening in the community. But sometimes, when he looked at his mother sewing by lamplight, her hands steady now and her breathing easy, he would remember that terrible night when he had left her to seek help. He would remember standing at the hospital gate, holding his cardboard sign, feeling invisible and afraid. And he would remember the moment when a man, the president of his entire country, had stopped, had seen him, had cared enough to help. Those memories reminded him of something important, that he was never as powerless as he had felt. That love could make a person brave, that asking for help wasn't weakness but strength, that sometimes the smallest voice could start the largest change. 1 year after that fateful morning at the hospital gate, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the nation to deliver his annual address. But unlike previous years, he didn't begin with economic statistics or policy achievements. He began with a story. "A year ago," he said, "I met a boy who changed my understanding of leadership. His name is Yasin. He was 8 years old, standing at a hospital gate with a cardboard sign. 6 words were written on that sign. My mother is sick. Please help." The audience, watching on televisions and phones across the country, leaned forward. They knew this story. It had become part of the national consciousness, a shared narrative that had touched millions of lives. "I could have walked past him," the president continued. "Many people did. They were busy, distracted, focused on their own concerns. But I stopped. And in stopping, I learned something that no amount of education or political experience had taught me. I learned that leadership is not about power or position. It is about seeing people, really seeing them, and choosing to act." He paused, letting his words settle. "In the year since I met Yasin, the Healing Hands Initiative has transformed healthcare in rural areas. We have trained over 5,000 community health workers. We have deployed 300 mobile medical units. We have treated more than 200,000 patients who previously had no access to care. We have saved lives that would have been lost." The statistics were impressive, but President Ibrahim knew that numbers alone didn't capture what had really changed. "More importantly," he said, "we have transformed how we think about governance and responsibility. We have learned that change doesn't require unlimited resources. It requires commitment, transparency, and the willingness to listen to those who need us most." He looked directly into the camera, speaking to every person watching. Yasin taught us that even the smallest voice matters, that even when you feel powerless, you have the power to change things. His courage inspired a nation. His love for his mother showed us what truly matters. And his 6 simple words on a cardboard sign did more to reform healthcare than decades of bureaucratic planning. After the address, President Ibrahim traveled back to Yasin's village. The journey was familiar now. He had made it several times over the past year, checking on progress, meeting with community members, ensuring that the promises made were being kept. The village had changed dramatically. The new health clinic was fully operational, staffed by a resident nurse and visited twice weekly by a doctor. Solar panels on the roof powered medical equipment and lighting. A well had been drilled, providing clean water. The school had expanded with 2 full-time teachers. The road leading to the village had been improved, making it accessible even during rainy season. But more than the physical changes, the spirit of the village had transformed. People walked with more confidence. There was less fear in parents' eyes when children got sick. There was hope where once there had been only resignation. Yasin, now 9 years old and taller, waited at the village entrance as the president's car approached. He still remembered everything about that desperate journey to the city. But now it felt almost like something that had happened to a different person, in a different life. When President Ibrahim emerged from the car, Yasin didn't bow or show excessive deference. Instead, they greeted each other as friends, with warm smiles and genuine affection. The president had a gift, a new sewing machine for Yasin's mother, far better than anything she had owned before. It was electric, powered by the solar installation at the clinic, and would allow her to work more efficiently and with less strain. They walked together to Yasin's house, which had been rebuilt with more solid materials. Brick walls, a proper roof, a real door. Inside, Yasin's mother was working on a wedding dress, her skilled hands creating something beautiful. When she saw the president, she stood immediately, a smile lighting her face. "Please sit," President Ibrahim said, gesturing for her to remain comfortable. "I've come to see how you're doing and to thank you." "Thank me?" she asked, confused. "But we are the ones who owe you everything. You saved my life." "No," President Ibrahim replied gently. "Your son saved your life. His courage, his refusal to accept that nothing could be done, his determination to find help, that's what saved you. And in saving you, he saved many others. He showed us all what we were capable of becoming." He turned to Yasin. "I have something for you as well." From his pocket, he pulled out a small box. Inside was a medal, simple but beautiful, engraved with words, "For courage that inspires a nation." Yasin looked at the medal, then at the president, his eyes wide. "But I just did what anyone would do," he said softly. "No," President Ibrahim corrected him. "You did what everyone should do, but few have the courage to do. You saw someone you loved in danger and you refused to give up. You took action when action seemed impossible. You are a hero, Yasin. Not because you wore a uniform or fought in a battle, but because you loved someone enough to risk everything for them." Tears came to Yasin's mother's eyes. She pulled her son close, holding him as if she would never let go. "My brave boy," she whispered. "My precious, brave boy." That evening, as the sun set over the village, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the entire community gathered for a celebration. There was food, more than enough for everyone, and music and dancing. Children ran and played. Adults talked and laughed. The president sat among them, not as a distant authority figure, but as a member of the community, sharing in their joy. At one point, Yasin climbed onto a small platform and spoke to the gathered crowd. His voice was still young and sometimes uncertain, but his words carried weight. "A year ago, I was scared. I thought my mother was going to die. I didn't know what to do or where to go. I felt so small, so powerless. But I learned something important. I learned that you don't have to be big or strong or powerful to make a difference. You just have to care enough to try." He held up his old cardboard sign, which had been carefully preserved. The edges were still bent, the words still visible, though faded. "This sign saved my mother, but it also started something bigger. It helped create this clinic. It brought doctors to our village. It reminded everyone that we matter, that our lives have value, that we deserve to be cared for." He looked at President Ibrahim. "Thank you for stopping. Thank you for seeing me when others looked away. Thank you for showing me that leaders can be kind, that power can be used to help instead of to control." The applause that followed was heartfelt and prolonged. President Ibrahim found himself unable to speak for a moment, overcome with emotion. When he finally stood to respond, his words were simple and sincere. Yasin, you have taught me more about leadership than I could ever teach you. You have reminded me why I chose this path, why I accepted this responsibility. You have shown me that the true measure of a society is not its wealth or power, but how it treats its most vulnerable members. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your heart. Thank you for reminding all of us what really matters. As the celebration continued into the night, Marie stood nearby, watching the scene with satisfaction. She thought about the photograph she had taken a year ago, the image that had sparked such profound change. She had captured a moment, but that moment had become a movement. She pulled out her phone and took another photograph. This one showed Yasin and President Ibrahim sitting together, the boy's mother beside them, all three smiling in the warm glow of lantern light. The image radiated joy, hope, and the profound connection that can exist between people when they choose to see each other's humanity. She posted this new photograph with a simple caption, "1 year later." The miracle continues. Love still changes everything. 3 years after Yasin stood at that hospital gate, the Healing Hands initiative had expanded across the entire nation. Every rural area now had access to basic health care. Maternal mortality rates had dropped by 40%. Childhood deaths from preventable diseases had declined dramatically. The program had become a model studied by other countries, facing similar challenges. But more important than the statistics was the change in how people thought about their relationship, to their government and to each other. The culture of looking away from suffering had been challenged. The assumption that nothing could be done had been replaced with a sense of collective responsibility. People had learned that they had power, not the power of wealth or position, but the power of compassion, of action, of refusing to accept that some lives mattered less than others. Yasin, now 11 years old, had become a symbol, though he tried not to let it affect his normal life too much. He attended school regularly, where he excelled in his studies. His